friend and colleague. Um, Good afternoon, everybody. Uh, everybody, yeah, I know. Yeah, we need to start the last session. After we evaluate, we assess SB's presidency in terms of his character, politics, human rights, and now finally we are going to assess his performance on the economy. You might remember at one time Bill Clinton said, after all, it's the economy. And then he added STUPID. Now that's a bit too much for me, but yeah. Yeah, and to assess SBA performance on the economy, we have three distinguished speakers. We have Professor Hal Hill, who talk about the general economy, and then we have Chris Manning, also from DNU, and Riyana Miranti from University of Canberra will talk about the social outcomes. Without further ado, I will give Hal Hill 20 minutes, and then Chris Manning 20 minutes, and after that we have Q&A. Please, Hal.
Selamat siang and hello again. This is a terrible thing to have inflicted upon you. You're seeing me twice, or hearing me twice. So I'll be brief. This is kind of, I think it's kelompok veteran actually. Kecuali Mira. Fortunately, Mira lowers the average age of the panel a lot. Terima kasih, Mira. So and thank you to the organisers. Thank you to the for the invitation. Thank you to all the helpers. It's been a wonderful update. Another problem with my presentation is I don't have Hario as my co-author. Is Hario somewhere around? Yeah, Hario, because Hario, you might have seen yesterday we presented, and Hario had these beautiful graphics. So maaf sekali, tanpa Hario artinya no graphics. And I'm conscious also we're standing between you, and it's a rather nice spring day in Canberra. The Floriade beckons, so we're standing between you and a lot of really interesting things. So we'll try and be fairly brief. Okay, so how do we start? First thing, I guess, is how do we evaluate the Yudhoyono era, the economy, stupid or not stupid? And there are two things to think about. First of all, what are the markers? How do we evaluate the record? And secondly, how do we attribute outcomes, or do we attribute outcomes to Yudhoyono himself or to other factors? Okay, let me say a little bit about both those things, the markers, the criteria for evaluating, and the attribution question. So the markers, well, I'm going to suggest 5 markers. Avoiding economic crises. In a sense, first principle of government is do no harm. Secondly, achieving rapid economic growth. Thirdly, raising living standards, especially protecting the poor. Fourthly, lifting institutional and governance quality, and fifthly, environmental sustainability. So Chris Manning and Mira are going to talk about the poor and inequality. They've got the really interesting stuff, actually. I'm very jealous. They've got the interesting stuff. We've already had presentations on environment, some on institutional quality, so I'm going to focus mainly on the first two. The sort of boring economic stuff, actually. So, or we could evaluate the record by President Yudhoyono's own markers. Remember, he said he's going to be pro-growth, pro-poor, pro-jobs, and pro-green. Or you could just say, well, simply holding the country together is quite an achievement. Consolidating democracy, mitigating conflict, that could be the criteria. Or you could say, well, let's just not look at the outcomes, but let's look at the means to getting those outcomes. And one of those means would be the quality of people that President Yudhoyono appointed, especially his cabinet appointments. It's also worth emphasising the regional environment, the global environment. This was a very volatile decade, so you've got to think about Indonesia in the context of this very volatile decade, both economically and politically. Also a little bit about who are the relevant comparators. Indonesia compared to what? And I think, as several other speakers have mentioned, it's not just one block of 10 years. It's different periods within the 10 years for President Yudhoyono himself, in particular Term 1 and Term 2. So there are the kind of issues. I've probably used about half my time already, but haven't I? So let's go quick. A few contextual factors. I'm just going to skip over these, but they're really important. You can't just evaluate this 10 years in isolation from any other period of Indonesia's history. There are a few things to mention contextually. First of all, the comparative growth experience does matter. Remember, Indonesia has been one of the few successful countries in the developing world economically. It's in the top decile of economic performance for developing countries. That may surprise some people who haven't got a sense of history, but the World Bank said it, so it must be right if the World Bank says it. Here's this rare group of countries that have grown quite fast over the last 50 years. That's the first contextual factor. Second contextual factor is that although Indonesia has grown fast for quite a lot of the period since the 60s, it's never grown as fast as the real East Asian stars, especially China, Korea, Singapore, and so on. It's worth remembering as well that President Yudhoyono came to power when Indonesia was really very fragile economically, politically, institutionally. It was just 5 years after the deepest economic crisis Indonesia had ever had. Remember, the economy collapsed. There was a growth collapse from peak to trough of 20 percentage points in 96 to 98. So, and in 2004, things were still pretty uncertain. So it's worth keeping in mind that little bit of history. And thinking about the regional and global environment, there really were three distinct periods. The first period, arguably the first 4 years of President Yudhoyono's rule, before the global financial crisis, this was a period of record commodity prices, a record commodity boom. Indonesia benefited greatly, especially from the China boom. Then there was this very hostile period globally when the global financial crisis occurred, beginning in about September 2008. So it was a very difficult year which Indonesia had to navigate through. And that was also, of course, coinciding with the end of the first Yudhoyono term and the election. So this was, in a sense, an unprecedentedly difficult time, and a lot of countries in the region experienced quite deep crises. And Indonesia actually navigated this period fairly well. This is just some graphics comparing the crisis of 97-98 with the crisis of 2008-9. And there wasn't a crisis in 2008-9. This is actually some work I did with our distinguished finance minister who kindly spoke yesterday. So the basic point is Indonesia navigated through that crisis very well. Then there's the third period, which has been a fairly volatile period as well, and a fairly anemic global economic recovery that Dr. Haryo and I spoke about yesterday. So managing this global environment, so this volatile environment. So these sort of contextual factors are relevant. I'll skip over some of this. Just worth mentioning a few other comparators. These are well-known faces. The Philippines and Indonesia had very similar crises. Philippines in 85, 86, Indonesia 97, 98. Philippines took 20 years after its crisis to recover to pre-crisis levels of income. Indonesia took 7, and that 7 was mainly preceding President Yudhoyono. That is, the economy came back to per capita levels about 2004. But remember, this was still, you've got to think of the conditions when he came to office, when there's still this great uncertainty, and whether there would be a reversion. Okay, so general economic survey, what do we say? Well, the economy recovered, as that graph shows, by around 2000, and then it grew quite strongly thereafter. You can see immediately that income hasn't grown as quickly in the Yudhoyono era as the Suharto era. So that's the first sort of the first general remark to make. It's recovered, but it hasn't grown as fast as before. Secondly, compared to the neighbours, Indonesia is about at par. And you can think of the neighbours here being Thailand and the Philippines. Indonesia is about at par with its neighbours. And this is kind of the new Southeast Asian norm, I think, for economic growth. It's not the spectacular growth rates of the past. It's sort of the 5 or 6 percentage points at best, not the 7 or 8. And Indonesia, very similar to Philippines and Thailand, with the difference that Indonesia navigated the global financial crisis more effectively in 2008-9. I haven't got time to go into the sort of the details of this economic performance. Just worth making a couple of points. If you disaggregate the story, and into some of the key sectors, what's been striking is that both agriculture and, in particular, manufacturing have not grown particularly fast. Now, within agriculture, of course, there's the export-oriented cash crop sector, the palm oils and so on, which have grown fast, but the food crop sector hasn't grown as fast, and arguably that's because of policy to some extent. In particular, the absence of rural infrastructure, much more concerned about distribution and rents rather than productivity, which was contrary to the policy settings of the earlier period, especially the 70s and 80s. And for manufacturing also, it hasn't grown. It's grown at about half the rate of the Suharto period, and that's for a number of reasons. Partly it's the China boom, and China's lowered the price of all manufacturers, so Indonesia finds it more competitive, more difficult to compete, but it's also policy factors, which I'll talk about later if I have time. Just now looking at a bit more detail at a few key points, sort of thing that economists think is important and nobody else thinks is important. That's the macroeconomic management story. You only notice it when you have a crisis. If you don't have a crisis, you take good macro management for granted, but believe me, it really matters when you have a crisis, and that's one of the reasons why both Australia and Indonesia came through the global financial crisis relatively unscathed. Now, the building blocks of this macro record for Indonesia were set in place before President Riyana became president. That is, the fiscal law, which limits budget deficits to 3%, was put in place in 2003 under President Megawati, and the independent central bank, Bank Indonesia, was in place after the crisis. So the architecture was already there for this fairly good macro record, but President Riyana certainly presided over it, and generally with bipartisan support, kira-kira, and he generally appointed very competent people to run the economy. That's a very important part of the story. And so one of the major achievements has been this dramatic fiscal consolidation. Just after the crisis, Indonesia's public finances were in a real mess. Public debt to GDP was almost 100%. It fell quickly, and again, the decline was preceding Yudhoyono's presidency, but it continued under him to now about 25%. One of the lowest in the G20, may even be the lowest, I can't remember. But that was a remarkable and successful fiscal consolidation, which certainly he presided over. So that's one important achievement. Also, he kept inflation. Inflation in Indonesia has always been a little bit too high, but it was kept under check. And again, that's a key macroeconomic building block which the administration achieved. It's higher than its neighbours, but it's still pretty respectable. But some caveats on the macro record. Well, the biggest caveat is obviously the fact that there's been no progress on subsidies. So this is really the biggest sort of negative legacy that President Yudhoyono is going to bequeath to President Jokowi. So here's the subsidy story. This is from the latest BIS survey, Robin Davies and Stephen Howe. So if you look at the green line, that's the subsidies as a share relative to GDP. And so when President Yudhoyono came in, they were a bit below 4%. They've gone up and down a bit, but basically they're now back to where they were at the beginning of this decade. So essentially no progress on the subsidies at all. The inflation record I've mentioned is a bit higher than neighbours, although not dramatically so. Tax efforts remain pretty weak, so I'm telling a story of, in a way, being macroeconomically prudent in a fiscal deficit sense, but leaving no fiscal space for anything else. So as our friend, the Deputy Finance Minister, Bambang Brojonegoro, often says, Indonesia's got 20 million registered taxpayers, 10 million file a return, and 1.5 million pay tax. So fairly weak tax effort. Has President Yudhoyono protected competent reforming ministers in the economic area? So here I'm a little bit biased because some of them are my friends. But clearly the case of Sri Mulyani was the second finance minister. First one was briefly Yusuf Anwar, second one Sri Mulyani. Ani obviously wasn't protected at that crucial period with the dispute with Mr. Bakri, and she was pushed out, and that was I think a big loss to the government. Although of course she was replaced by a competent person, Pak Agus, and then now of course a very good one, Pak Dede Basri. Mari Pangestu, also another star in the economics cabinet, was trade minister for the first term and I think 2.5 years of the second term. I think Māori was basically pushed aside when protectionist pressures became a fair bit stronger, and that was, I think, a loss to the cabinet, and you can see that in the way trade policy is being structured ever since. So the macro record, by and large, in an aggregate sense, is quite successful, but there's a big agenda of reform which hasn't been touched. A digression, which I probably haven't got time for. Just a question. Indonesia's had two big commodity booms in the 70s and the past decade. Which one did it manage better? I'd argue actually it managed the first one better, the 1970s commodity boom. It managed better than the current one. And now the current one, of course, occurred mainly under President Yudhoyono, but I think probably I'll skip that. But happy to come back to it because it is quite an important part of the story. On general sort of business climate and openness and so on, it's a mixed record. Tariffs are fairly low. Indonesia's constrained by AFTA, the ASEAN Free Trade Area, which is about to morph into the ASEAN Economic Community beginning December next year. I don't think Indonesia's ready for it, at least in a policy sense. Clearly, in the last few years, there've been a proliferation of a lot of non-transparent trade barriers. Economists call them non-tariff barriers. And they occurred especially after Minister Mari Pangestu departed the Trade Ministry, and she was obviously holding them back for quite a long time. And so we've seen this rising economic nationalism, which I think is going to create real problems for Indonesia in the post-commodity boom era, when it's got to achieve different sources of growth. In a sense, I think to attribute the problem to President Yudhoyono would be a little bit tough, I think, because remember, in fact, this is Hati Basri's PhD thesis from ANU. There's always been this inverse correlation between high commodity prices and economic policy. That is, whenever commodity prices are high, you get this sense of economic nationalism. We don't need foreigners and their money, and so economic policy becomes a lot more restrictive and a lot more nationalistic. And that's exactly what happened in the 70s until it was reversed in the 80s, and it's been what's happening in the past decade. So to attribute that to President Yudhoyono himself, I think would be a stretch. So he obviously presided over it, but you wouldn't say he was the driver of it. And then a lot of discussion about an improved investment climate and summits and everything else, but not much progress. On the rankings, in terms of the comparative rankings, Indonesia hasn't changed much. We've seen some of these already, business climate and so on. Then moving on to a couple of other topics just quickly. How much time do I have left? 6 minutes, okay. Infrastructure. Well, infrastructure has clearly bedeviled the Yudhoyono administration. Lots of summits, several master plans, but it's a major area of underperformance, and it's really holding back the economy, and it's holding back all of us when we try and get around Jakarta and other big cities too. So infrastructure spending as a percent of GDP is relative to the economy is about half what it used to be under the Suharto era. It's about half of what it is in the high-performing East Asian economies. Question, I guess, is can you attribute the problem to the president himself? Well, yes and no. It's partly because of tight fiscal policy, which was an inheritance from the crisis of 97, 98. It's partly because the DPR makes the investment environment for infrastructure very unattractive. Now, again, is that the President's responsibility or is it the Parliament's? It's also partly because of the absence of state-owned enterprise. Remember, Indonesia has this large state-owned enterprise sector, largely unreformed, and a lot of them do have a lot of say over infrastructure policy, the electricity, the port regulators and so on, and very little reform there as well. It's also partly because of interjurisdictional cooperation issues between the central government and local government. And again, this is an inherited issue for President Yudhoyono. The laws came in 2001, and in a sense, this is also a system which is sort of work in progress, and land access. So clearly, the president presided over this serious problem. To sheet home all the blame to him, I think, would be a little bit tough. So just some indicators on the usual story on logistics and so on. I haven't really got time to talk about this, but it is relevant. Dirk Thompson talked about the regional autonomy situation, again something inherited by President Yudhoyono. There was a big bang decentralisation, happened arguably too quickly without enough preparation. So this is a system which is work in progress. It also means, of course, you've got a much weaker central Jakarta government trying to run the country, and so whether you would say that the the remaining difficulties to do with the central-region relations and the local government performance is Yudhoyono's responsibility. I think, again, it's a bit tough. Education, another issue we discussed at the update 2 years ago, where there's been rather disappointing progress in spite of the 20% expenditure commitment. Now, again, of course, education is now primarily a local government responsibility, so that's a clear case where most of the responsibility has to be taken at the local government level, although with the national government playing a role. So just a few indicators. I'll skip these indicators and sort of sum up. So how would you sum up the story? Well, on the economy, well, you'd say the following, I guess. First of all, and consistent with what other people have said, this has been a president who's been extremely cautious on almost every major economic policy issue. It's hard to think of an issue where he's led a reform agenda on the economy. He's inherited a system which was fragile, but which had the building blocks for reasonably successful macroeconomic management, and he consolidated those building blocks, arguably, appointing competent finance ministers, competent central bank governors. I mean, that is really crucial. It's a bit like what Evie said this morning. You've got to think of the counterfactual, what it could have been with less competent ministers and governors of central banks. So the macroeconomy story, I think, is by and large a successful one, but almost every other reform area there hasn't been progress. And the obvious ones I mentioned, the subsidies, the infrastructure, the labour market, and the fact that there's very little formal sector employment growth, and the rising economic nationalism. So it's a mixed agenda, I think, and clearly President Yudhoyono presided over the fastest increase in inequality in Indonesia's history. Again, well, this is the story for the next presentation. It's a bit tough to attribute the increase to him, but at least he presided over it. And that's going to be a challenge for the next administration. I want to finish with a quote. This is from a good friend of mine who's in the cabinet of a neighbouring ASEAN country, and we correspond regularly, and I told him I was going to give this presentation on a balance sheet of the Yudhoyono administration, and this is a person who knows Indonesia reasonably well from a neighbouring ASEAN country perspective, a person of great integrity with no barrow to push, and this is what he said to me. This is my friend, the cabinet member from country X, and country X is another ASEAN country. And as a very distinguished commentator, he said, "For a distant observer like me, the achievements of SBY are for the great books. During the years I have served in the cabinet of X, I had the opportunity of listening to him," that's President Yudhoyono, "in executive sessions and meeting him. He strikes me as a man of conviction and great leadership. He has effectively projected Indonesia's influence and leadership in ASEAN. We hope we will come to achieve what he has achieved in his office." So there it is. Half full or half empty is the question for the glass. Thank you.
That was very full, that conclusion, I must say. It's a hard job to come after Hal Hill, but I'll see what we can do. Thanks very much for inviting me to come. I really do live in Yogyakarta. It wasn't a joke before, and so getting some support to travel down to here is very welcome. We faced a little bit of a dilemma, a little bit like Simon Bart. I said, yes, wonderful. Didn't really look at the tasks that I was given, and that was jobs, poverty and income distribution, all of which there are massive numbers of papers by micro and macroeconomic researchers. And about a month ago I opened my invitation and I thought, by God, how am I going to do this? Anyway, there was one great saving grace. I found that Riyana Miranti had been involved in an OECD publication very recently on income distribution and poverty, and so she's very kindly agreed to jointly do the presentation with me. So there was a bit of a way out. Okay. Now I'll just start with the main arguments. There are really three main arguments. I think economists sort of, we're sort of looking at the bright side of things on some things. The first one is that SBY governments have made major progress in poverty and has been very innovative on policy. And I take issue a bit with Ed's statement that the fall in poverty is sort of cancelled out by the increase in inequality. I don't think that's right. I think the achievements in poverty stand alone, and will be, when we look back, I think we'll look at the Riyana years as one in which there were very major achievements in that field, and it's as much in results as in process, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So I hope I'm not biting the hand that feeds me, but I do take issue that Indonesia has not made some pretty major achievements, I think, in the area of poverty alleviation. More as much in process as in results. Second one, there have been lots of better jobs. A lot of people have, and incomes have risen. However, the foundations for sustained poverty alleviation through the labour market are not there. And I think that's one of the major weaknesses. Third, as Hal and everyone else has said, income distribution has worsened a lot in the last 10 years. But we do add that much has, as Hal mentioned too, has been beyond the government's control. The income distribution story is really one in which the investment boom in resources and the rise in commodity prices has led to higher returns to capital, to land, to labour, and to rents from those who control those resources. But labour's in there as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So those are the three main messages. I just want to say something about an approach. We're going to try and look at these issues in an interrelated way. And very briefly, improved living standards for the poor is also critical for income distribution. It's an obvious point, but we should remember it. And secondly, at the heart of a successful poverty alleviation program, there must be more equitable, there must be better jobs. And I think the most important ones for a country at Indonesia's stage of development are improved agricultural productivity. Why agriculture? Because 40% of the people work in agriculture, and many of them in very poor circumstances. And secondly, moving people out of low productivity agriculture, because that's the story of economic development almost everywhere in the world, that if you have 40% of your population in a land-constrained environment, that ultimately they're going to have to move out to improve living standards. The third interrelationship is that increasing inequality in income distribution is common in middle-income countries. So we need to remember that. I mean, there's only a few countries in the world where moving from a low-income countries to a middle-income country, income distribution has stayed relatively equal. Mostly it's got worse. And that was part of the Kuznets story as well. Piketty's new book talks about the developed countries and how income distribution has not got better for the richer countries. But the processes that are going on in Indonesia are not unique by any means. I've gone quite a long way. We've got 4 sections. We're going to run through these sections fairly quickly now. But we're going to talk about economic policy very briefly, just refer back to some of the things Hal said, talk a bit about the labour market, poverty trends and policies, and then Mira is going to pick up the story on income distribution. The points on economic policy: prudent economic policy is good for the poor, especially in relation to stable prices. Remember in 1998, the biggest single factor that led to the rise in poverty was the increase in prices. the inflation rate was close to 100%, and that's what above more than anything else led to the rise in the poverty rates. Second, a resources boom is both a benefit and a curse for the poor. Bigger rents bring returns to resource owners, but they also contribute to rising prices, to an overvalued exchange rate, and it hurts consumers, workers, and exporters. And finally, I think from the economic overview, squibbing it on fuel prices has been particularly bad for the poor, at least in the medium term. Now on to jobs and wages. We focus on two contrasting periods for SBY, and that's why I asked the question a little bit earlier. The first period actually was one where things were very difficult. There were very few jobs created, and a lot of people have written about jobless growth. The second period, there's some big gains in the modern sector labour market. Investment was coming into Indonesia. Wages went up in some sectors, but wages remained depressed at the bottom. So that's part of the failure of the structural change in the labour market. And this figure sort of sets it out, the SBY's first term and SBY's second term, and mirrors showing the very flat modern sector employment with this in the orange line, and the rise in the informal sector during that period. But it turned around quite dramatically in the second period, and so there's been a big expansion of formal sector work, and although it's tapered off in the last couple of years. Surprisingly, both unemployment and underemployment came down fairly sharply in SBY's second term. Surprisingly for me, because for a long while I was writing about the first period, and things have certainly changed rather dramatically. The turnabout of jobs in SBY's second term still masks, however, what I think is the underlying problem of surplus labour in Indonesia, and you sense it when you go into rural Java in particular. The government adopted a new wage policy in 2012-2013, declaring the era of low wages as being over. It was actually declared. And in doing that, I believe it bet on a vocal majority in protected jobs in pushing up minimum wages very rapidly. I'm certainly not against minimum wage legislation. I think it's important, but a 44% increase in minimum wages, which occurred in Jakarta, was very high and destabilising in my view. And very quickly, the increases in wages in SBY's second term, you can see, and at the bottom are agricultural wages, and they've remained relatively low, and the gap between the two is increased. So it's not part of the inequality story, or not a major part of it, but certainly contributes to it. And just on the minimum wages, that very sharp increase in minimum wages in 2012-2013. It has started in Jakarta, but it's spread to many places in Indonesia. And Ahok, of course, was heavily involved. He was on the truck announcing to the unions and the workers in the metal unions, metal workers union, that wages would go up by 44%, and they were overjoyed. The next year, he reconsidered. He thought, maybe we'll have a slightly smaller wage increases, when he saw how much he had to pay to many of his workers. Besides the high wage policy, the other what I think is the real shortcoming of the SBY government's policies have been in agriculture. The tight control over agricultural imports, the great emphasis on food security rather than productivity, and indeed the domination of the agricultural ministry by one party, political party, or as a minister at least, with some dire consequences many people know. Now turning quickly to poverty, and the poverty story. The SBY government really has made some pretty major progress on poverty, both, as I mentioned, in the results and in process. And this sort of shows, I think many people know about the sustained decline in poverty in both his first term and SBY's second term. I'll move through there. Internationally, Indonesia's done pretty well. It's much closer to China and Vietnam than it is to Philippines or India on poverty decline. And the MDG goals, even maternal mortality, though I suspect I might get a question about where these figures come from. Even maternal mortality, there's been some significant improvements. Indonesia's done pretty well on all of those things. Now, just turning very quickly to the programs, and this is a broad overview. There are many problems with all of them, but I think the bottom line is that the unconditional cash transfers, the BLT, have improved significantly over time. Regional and community-based program, the PMPM, the President's favourite, is now studied by many people across the world as one of the most successful programs of its type. That's true also of the conditional cash transfer program, which Indonesia took over from a number of Latin American countries and developed on it. And there have been a range of other programs. The weakest has been the Ruskin program, both in targeting and in leakages, and all the programs have had some difficulties. But I think the bottom line is that's a pretty remarkable achievement. And finally, on poverty, I think the most, in process, the very strong support that the Vice President's office received and gave to the programs, the Vice President's personal effort in guiding these programs, their design and their implementation, his influence across the bureaucracies in getting implementation pushed through, and the very high quality of research. And I think one has to mention that this is one of the major contributions that Australia has ever made to a developing country program in the area of poverty, and should be very proud of it. And I do hope that Australia will continue to support these programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Chris. It's a great pleasure to be here, actually. Standing here with my former supervisors, so because 3 of them actually my former supervisors. But it's actually quite a bit scary as well, than the expectation I have to be trying as best, probably as good as them, actually. So I would just following up with the income distribution. I think as what have been explained earlier with Pak Chris, the increasing inequality is actually a global phenomenon, and it's happening in both developed and developing countries. So it's happening in OECD countries, even in most egalitarian countries such as Germany, Denmark, and Sweden, for example. And then it's also happening in Asian countries, including Indonesia. And then what we observe is that increasing faster in Indonesia than in the most of the neighbors. Like among the comparable set of data that we can see that the annual changes in inequality for Indonesia is actually second after China. And then we have observed also that inequality rising faster in urban than in rural areas. And then it's also reinforcing the story that Chris explained earlier, particularly the increasing wage in the formal sector. So the role of labor market also played a role here. So this is the one, the graph that I said earlier about the changes in terms of Indonesian inequality. So if you can see, Indonesia actually ranked second after the China, and then even higher if you compare with, for example, like countries like India or Bangladesh. And then this chart shows the Gini coefficient from 1996 to 2013. Gini is the most common measure of inequality, ranges between 0, perfect equality, to 1, perfect inequality. And then usually countries have a Gini index around 0.3, 0.7. Also, although like most countries have around like 0 to 0.4, 0.5. As we can see here, significantly worsened, increased by 8 percentage points during the SBY years, particularly increased by 5 percentage points during the second term. But also there is one particular one particular point that I have to mention here, that actually between 2005 to 2006, inequality actually declined because this is due to the cash transfer compensation given to the poor families after the increase of fuel price in that period. And this is Gini index urban and rural. As you can see that it's higher in urban area, but then actually Gini increases both in rural and urban. So it's really actually a national phenomenon. And then I would like now to compare the situation between the top 10% and also the lowest 20% from the consumption and wage. And later on, we also discuss some from the wealth perspective. What we observe is a higher growth in average consumption of the top 10% and the bottom 20%. So although growth actually have an impact to increase income for everybody, but actually the impact, the increase at the top is actually faster than the one in the bottom. Increased share to the top, as I explained earlier before. So that the richest 10% has now consumed more than 4 times of the bottom 20%. So this is based on the 2011 data that we have, compared to 3.4 times in 2005 and 2.7 times just post the Asian financial crisis. And then in terms of the wages, the richest 10% has also earned almost 6 times than those who are in the bottom 20%. So this is, so you can see this is from the consumption. So between the top 10% and also the bottom 20%. And this is the share of total wage. So if you can see, the share of total wage of the highest 10% is actually increased from 25% in 2004 to around 32% in 2012. And while the share of total wage for the lowest 20%, the second lowest 20% actually declined, as you can see, from 7.7% to 5.4 and 16.2 to 12.9. So those who are on the top decile is this cover like people like in managers, professionals, like skilled employees. So like the demand for the skilled employees actually increased during this period. So after discussing about consumption and then about wage, and we discussed about wealth, well, even less distributed than consumption or than income as in most societies. Although wealth per adult has been growing during the SBY period faster than China and India, but what we see is also like concentrated. Top 10% hold like 75% total wealth in 2013, while top 1% actually hold nearly half the total wealth in Indonesia. Although I can show you the graph, like here, Indonesia is in the middle, so at the China, the blue line, and then India is the green line. It's really interesting in comparison to India, like when we started almost the same thing, I mean in 2000, but actually the gap is becoming so like, you know, it's diverged. So like in Indonesia and India, it's really diverging. And then the wealth actually increased around like 9% per annum, like, which is like faster than economic growth. It's around like 4 or 5%. So part of the story of increasing income inequality is also because of the policies. Like current fiscal policy leads to a small reduction in poverty and inequality with less equalizing effect. Like, for example, have been actually discussed, like previous research found the fuel subsidies as regressive in nature, and then this preclude key expenditure of infrastructure that's required to create a better job and raising income for the bottom end of the distribution. Pak Hal already mentioned as well about the low ratios of Indonesian tax revenues to GDP, which is around like 12%, and low collection rates and also low compliance. So this is the one that just show that fiscal actually less equalizing in Indonesia, tax revenue. So I'd just like to summarize. I think the potential reason why increasing inequality during the SBY years is it's related to the issue of wealth or asset distribution, increasing share of the top 10% of consumption and wage. Part is related to labor market. Part is also related to policies, particularly fiscal policies, and other factors as also explained earlier about the resource boom in 2000. So I would like to conclude. What we observe is like a really mixed record. SBY's government made much progress in poverty, both on the policy and implementation. So it's really big positive, but also like precarious on the ambivalence on job and labors, and also about like political populist consideration, increasingly important in SBY's second term, and then at what you observe, the income distribution was a lot. So I think I'll finish there. Thank you.
20 minutes for Q&A. Is there any question? One, two, three. Zulfan.
Thank you. I'm Zulfan from University of Western Sydney. My question is to Pak Chris and Ibu Mira. Yeah, inequality is back to the agenda, okay? And if I understood the situations correctly in Indonesia, the wisdom about poverty and inequality was, don't worry about poverty, don't worry about inequality. What you need to worry is just about poverty. When you kill poverty, the other bird will die as well. So that was the wisdom that I understood from the academic circle and policy circle in Indonesia. And the wisdom was actually from the wisdom from Washington in late 90s, if you like. So I'm sure that the wisdom is no longer correct now. I mean, since the Piketty effect, for example. So how would you comment on that one? Thank you, Pak.
Yeah, a very short question. We talked a lot about fuel subsidies. In the context of the Gini index worsening, has anyone made any estimates of what would happen to the Gini index if fuel subsidies were removed?
Okay, Tony Reid from ANU. In the Suharto era, there was, as we've seen, much less inequality, but much greater rage against the rich, often extremely racially inflected. Can you explain why there is much more inequality, but much less rage, and apparently no sign that I've been aware of the racial dimension of that rage now? And are we in a much better place, or is it simply temporarily disguised, this rage?
Harus diskusi dulu dengan former supervisor. Okay, so I'll just answer a question about the Gini index. What's happening if that food subsidies actually removed, right? Yeah, we haven't actually done the kind of exercise. But what happened is that the thing that I haven't actually shown you is like, I haven't actually got the chance last time. It's like there has been a analysis when it sees that the fiscal policy in Indonesia actually less equalizing. So what happened is when we compare to other countries such as like Brazil or Mexico, it's actually when taking into account the subsidies and everything, actually Gini actually declined. Then what happened with Indonesia, with our fiscal policy, what happened is it just declined by 6%, while other countries just declined by around 10%. So what this is my expectation with HAPO. I think it will be a really good exercise actually to do that. But I think what happened if it is taken because previous result actually saying that the subsidy is actually regressive, right? I think it will be much lower decline in the Gini coefficient. I think it's less than 6% that we actually already done. So that is, I guess, one comment of that. Then for Zulfan, I agree with you. I think that is also when I presented some of my funding back last year when about inequality. I think a lot of the comment is like about poverty. Like I think we have to just like the policy is about how to reduce poverty and then not to focus much on inequality. What matters is poverty reduction. But I will just claim that it's actually probably not. We have to also start to look at the inequality as well, because what's happening is, of course, like economic growth is like increasing income for everybody, right? And then improving the bottom of distribution actually also, yeah, it will be good for poverty as well, but also it's also important for inequality. So I will also argue that focusing on inequality also is actually important. So.
Got rage, have I? Rage against the rich that Tony Reid is. I think it's probably up to someone else, one of the political scientists or sociologists, to answer that question. I mean, I think the ethnic division component is different, of course. The Chinese no longer control as much of the wealth and the growing wealth than they did in times gone past. I can't give you a figure, so that's an assertion. But if you look at Indonesia's richest number of individuals or conglomerates, there are many more non-Chinese in that group. So that might be one explanation, but perhaps someone else would have.
Let's open up one more session. One over there, I think this guy and John Cedar. The first, yeah, please, Eric first.
Yeah, thanks. My question is really for Chris and Riyana. You've both said what excellent progress Indonesia is making in reducing poverty, but how can you say that when over 50% of the population subsist on less than $2 a day? And then secondly, what are the prospects of Indonesia really making progress there when the economy is so heavily focused on exploitation of the natural resource sector, and then those profits go to enriching the rich and powerful? They're not being invested in building a more productive economy. And there's a lot of reports that show Indonesia is falling behind compared to other countries in the region in terms of its international competitiveness.
Thank you.
Killian Nolan from IPAC. You mentioned the ASEAN Economic Community, and I'm just wondering, is it happening? And is it something that the Yudhoyono administration has been preparing for?
Thank you. My name is Agung from ANU. My question is one for Pak Hal and one for Pak Chris. For Hal, you mentioned that Indonesia need a new growth strategy or the new source of growth, but we see or we listen from the media that Jokowi tends to use slogan equity for growth. It's different from Suharto era. We heard growth for equity, and then from SBY growth with equity, and now Jokowi look like to introduce equity for growth. So, what is the prospect of the growth acceleration during Jokowi era?
Okay, just one. John?
Quick comment, and as per Chris's request, in response to Tony Reid's question, anti-Chinese violence never correlated closely with economic crisis. In fact, it took manufacturing on the part of the Suharto regime and its last dying gasps to produce something that then died with the Suharto regime anti-Chinese violence. But a question for the economists. You sound like economists, but not development economists. The World Bank office in Jakarta has said that the Yudhoyono era was one of a lost decade in terms of industrial deepening, that manufacturing has stagnated. In the long term, isn't that a disastrous legacy in terms of the imperative of industrial growth and deepening in the country for its long-term future?
So thanks very much. Fortunately, all the questions are going to Chris and Mira. Huh? But a few points. ASEAN Economic Community, someone asked about. Well, so Ibu Evi talked about this morning. Is Ibu Evi still here? Yeah, hi. So ASEAN Economic Community starts December next year. It's the most ambitious regional integration program for ASEAN. Remember, it's still operating under a thing called the ASEAN Free Trade Area, which was 1992. So it's time for something more. It's quite ambitious. It aims to have a seamless Southeast Asian economy for trade, and also trade in goods, also trade in services, and to allow investment to move freely and to allow professional labour to move freely. So ASEAN, I mean, I'm a great admirer of ASEAN. I mean, as Edie said this morning, imagine Southeast Asia without ASEAN. It's been tremendously important. But ASEAN has always had a propensity to issue grand declarations and initiatives and programs which can't be achieved, at least can't be achieved in their timetable. So the ASEAN Economic Community will start on December. It was originally going to start January 2015. Now it's December 2015. And it'll sort of move forward, but it'll move forward slowly, I'm guessing. And we've seen already, for example, some of Indonesia's policies are actually contrary to the spirit of the AEC, like the proposed restriction on investments in plantations, which are mainly from Malaysia. So it'll be a forward step, but it won't be a forward step as fast as the plan looks like. And I'm guessing that Indonesia will be a somewhat reluctant participant compared to Singapore, which will be wanting to go faster. But it's sort of forward movement, but just fairly slow forward movement, is how I'd say it. Pak Agung, I don't pretend to understand the mentality of Pak Jokowi, so I don't know what equity for growth means actually, but clearly, as Pak Haryo and I argued yesterday, Indonesia does need a new growth strategy, and the new growth strategy is going to be forced upon it because the era of high commodity prices is over, and as we tried to argue yesterday, historically, Indonesia has been a much more effective macroeconomic manager than it has been a microeconomic manager. So, as I argued yesterday briefly, I think Indonesia is now where it was in the early 1980s. That is, the macro policy framework is reasonably good. The micro policy framework is going the other way completely. And that was the story in the 1970s. And then it took the second round reforms in the 1980s for Indonesia to really get the major reforms, which then were very successful. So, question now for the new administration is, can it do something like what was done, in a sense, 30 years ago? I mean, in a new environment, but the same principles are sort of there, and it's not clear yet that the policy narrative is actually heading in that direction. So that's the big challenge, I think. So John's question was sort of both of us. John, so the manufacturing story. Indonesia again grew very fast. Its industrial sector grew very fast during the Suharto era, over 10% a year. The past decade it's grown about 5% a year. Is that a problem? Yes and no. I'm an economist, yes and no. It's not a problem in the sense that when you have a resource boom, the manufacturing sector is not going to grow as fast. I mean, that's a classic Dutch disease. That is, resources move out of the so-called tradables into the booming sector. So in that sense, it's what you'd expect, actually. So that's not a problem. Yes, it's a problem because to the extent that the slower growth is because of the factors holding back a much more efficient, outward-looking industrial sector, yes, it is a problem. And that gets back to some of the issues we've been talking about already in the conference. It's also the case that I think Indonesian policymakers have decided it's too difficult to reform in certain key areas. For example, I think Indonesian policymakers, this was evident in several conferences I've been to recently, have basically concluded that Indonesia can't compete in a few key areas. And they include the traditional labour-intensive areas like footwear and garments, which have been often the beginnings of this rapid East Asian-style export-oriented industrialisation. I've heard several Indonesian policymakers, very sensible ones, say we can't compete. And that's what they're saying, I think, is it's at the moment too hard to reform. If they could reform, they could certainly compete. Another example, which we mentioned briefly yesterday, is in the global production networks, where Indonesia's missing out a lot. And there's no reason why it should miss out. I mean, with the sort of reforms we know, as I mentioned yesterday, a very fine PhD thesis written here by Mukti a couple of years ago, we know with those reforms it could compete. It's dealing itself out of the current negotiations, a thing called the International Technology Agreement, which governs the trade in electronics and parts and components. Now about half of intra-ASEAN trade is that, and more than half of intra-East Asian trade is that, and it's dealing itself out of the current negotiations in Geneva by saying it's not a participant in them. So it's clear where it should go, and the question is, will the political economy adjust enough? I mean, remember the old Sudley law, good times make for bad policies and bad times for good policies. That's the question for Indonesia at the moment, I think.
Yeah, so I just got the question on poverty, yeah? I mean, are we, how can I say that poverty is a major achievement? Well, if you sort of go back to the crisis period and the ramshackle system of social support, which half or almost half of the support went to people that were not poor, and about half the poor never got anything. And you see the system now that they've got in place, you'd be most impressed. I do urge you to look at some of the work that TNP Duakar have been doing and Smeru. There's a lot of evaluation of it, and they're not perfect by any means. But Indonesia stands up there as one of the leading countries in support for the poor. Social security is another matter. Indonesia is way behind on social security. The numbers of poor have gone down by about 10 million. That's half the Australian population over the period of the SPY years. So that's no small achievement. Many of them are still vulnerable, but it's no mean achievement. So I suppose the other part of the answer is the only other way that I can think that Indonesia could make a significant impact on poverty is if it was growing much faster. And for numerous reasons that Hal's explained, it did not.
Really sorry, time is up. We have to close down this session. Please join me to thank this excellent presentation. Before we close down this conference, I would like to invite Ed Espinal.
Thanks. Well, thank you, everyone who stayed to the end. And I hope you'll agree with me that we've had a very rich discussion over these 2 days, a very stimulating set of papers trying to come to grips with the SPY years and the SPY legacy. One thing I think we've learned in trying to assess this legacy is that many of our tasks in doing so bring us back to these kind of classic issues of structure versus agency, and we even heard some of that in the previous session. To what extent was SBY's achievements or lack of achievements in particular areas really a product of the structural conditions that he faced, his government faced, and to what extent were they a result of his particular political choices, even his personality? And I think we heard this perhaps debated most clearly in the session involving Greg Feely and John Seidel, but it was a thread that ran through a lot of our sessions. So I hope you found that stimulating, and 2 points arise from this. If you're still not satisfied, or if it's still not all clear in your mind, well, just wait for the book, which will be out, we hope, by about May next year, so keep your eyes open for that. The second obvious point is to thank all of our speakers who've made such a wonderful contribution. Our keynote speaker in particular, Ibu Dewi, I think John Seidel has come the furthest, but everyone who's joined us from Indonesia and from different parts of Australia, thank you all very much. And to you in particular, and a little note as well directed specifically to our speakers, who are also, of course, writers of the book chapters. It's far from all being over now. And in fact, immediately after we close today, if you could just come right down here to the podium, and we're going to have a short, what's the word, pep talk. My Marcus Mietzner is going to give you some gentle input on where we're going from now. A few other things as we close, and I should say I'm speaking here on behalf of not only myself but the two other conveners, Marcus and Dirk Thompson. We have a few institutions and a few people to thank. Firstly, in terms of the institutions, those who've sponsored this activity and therefore made it all possible. Of course, DFAT, the main supporter of the Indonesia project, we thank you very deeply. The Australian National University, the College of Asia Pacific and its various component parts who've contributed, and also the various institutions that have supported some of the speakers in getting here. Thank you very much. But as well, of course, as the people who've appeared down here at the podium, many people have worked very hard behind the scenes to make this this conference possible. We're extremely lucky in the first place in having a very large team of volunteers who've been organising the microphones, staffing the desk, and also making sure the IT has gone so seamlessly and performing a lot of other jobs. Let me just quickly run through the names. These are Denny, Agung, Widi, Vina, Leah, Adele, Aan, Lady, Elsa, Friska, Eki, Edward, that's not me, Tiara, Donny, Joseph, Wisnu, and Shirin. So thank you very much. We really appreciate everything you've done. In particular, in addition, I should say, we are also, as conveners, really extremely fortunate in having a very experienced and highly professional and extremely reliable core staff here at the Australian National University in the Indonesia project and in the Department of Political and Social Change who've run many of these conferences in the past, and people have come up to me at various times over the last couple of days and congratulated me. Everything's running so smoothly, and really we as conveners can claim very little credit for how well the organisation has gone. Instead, we really need to thank Kathy Haberle. Kathy, at the back there. Thank you, Kathy. Chut Nuka. Where is Nuka? She's right at the back. And Ali as well. I don't know if Ali is still here, but thank you very much as well, Alison Lee. And of course, Budy is the... how could I forget? Finally, thank you everyone for coming. I know many of you have come from far afield, and it's been wonderful to have such a well-attended conference with such great questions, comments, and of course, informal discussions. So that's it from me, representing the thank you, Marcus. It wasn't quite everything from me, but what I will draw your attention to is there is what looks to be a really fabulous exhibition starting today, I think it's right, and open until sometime this afternoon at the Australian National Portrait Gallery. So a new exhibition on Indonesian contemporary modern portraiture. So I apologise we don't have some of the pictures from the publicity material up on the screen, but it does look like a wonderful exhibition. So for those who are from out of town, I would suggest you go there rather than to Floriade. Finally, let me thank you all once more and hand back to Budy. Thanks.
I think we all agree that this is one of the best Indonesia Update conference, and please join me to thank Ed, Marcus, and Dirk for their excellent presentation. Before we close down, I would like to invite the conveners of next year Indonesia Update. Next year it will be convened by John McCarthy and Kathy Robinson. Let me invite John to tell a bit about what is their plan for next year. Please, John.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Budy. First of all, I'd like to, Dirk, Ed, and Marcus obviously set the bar very high for us next year. Kathy Robertson, actually, who's my co-convener, she's actually on the airplane to Europe right now, so I'm left with the job of introducing our topic for next year. It was quite interesting listening to the last discussion by Mira. We can see one of the main assets where we see rising inequality really is land. And so next year we're going to be focusing on land. In fact, the provisional title of our update next year is Land and Development in Indonesia, Searching for the People's Sovereignty. So we want to look at all sorts of issues to do with land as a major asset in Indonesia, where we see rising inequality, I guess, particularly to do with land reform, mining, adat and indigenous rights and forestry, as well as economic development, infrastructure and land. So we look forward to seeing many of you next year. Of course, our program is still in preparation, so we're still thinking through all the different issues. So I think I don't want to stand between you and heading off for your Saturday afternoon, whatever. So thank you all, and we'll hope to see you all next year.
Just a reminder, next year will be 18 and 19 of September. See you then.